My name is Walter Briggs, and I am 78 years old. 3 weeks ago, at my son's company Christmas party, in front of my own grandchildren, my son leaned toward his colleagues, gestured toward me with his glass of eggnog, and said that his father was, and I'm quoting him exactly, basically worthless, never built anything, never amounted to anything worth talking about. His colleagues laughed uncomfortably. My grandchildren, 8 and 11 years old, stood there absorbing every word. 20 minutes later, my son's company CEO walked directly across that crowded ballroom, past executives and clients and colleagues, straight to me, and before anyone could process what was happening, he came to full attention and saluted. If you've ever been called worthless by your own child, in front of the very grandchildren who look up to you, stay with me until the end. Because this story isn't about revenge against my son. It's about what happens when the truth walks into a room at exactly the moment two children needed to see it most. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what that CEO said once the room went silent. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that Christmas party, because otherwise the word worthless won't carry the weight it's actually supposed to carry in this story. I enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1966, 18 years old, out of a small mill town outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, at a moment when a boy from a town like mine didn't have many illusions about where enlistment would eventually lead. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, and I want to tell you about a specific action during my second tour, in 1969, that matters enormously to understanding everything that happened at that Christmas party 56 years later. Though I want to be honest up front, that I've spent the better part of my adult life finding this particular chapter genuinely difficult to discuss in any real detail. My unit was providing security for a forward operating position that came under sustained, coordinated attack in the early hours of a morning I still, even now, occasionally revisit in dreams I've learned across decades how to survive without fully escaping. I remember the specific quality of darkness that night, the way sound seemed to arrive before the eye could confirm what was actually happening, the particular disorientation of a coordinated assault beginning simultaneously from multiple directions. During the initial hours of that assault, our position's communications equipment was damaged, cutting us off from the kind of coordinated artillery and air support that could have significantly changed the trajectory of that engagement. I volunteered along with 2 other Marines to move roughly 600 yards through contested ground to reach a secondary communications relay point, a movement that took the better part of 3 hours under intermittent enemy fire, 3 hours during which I genuinely didn't expect to survive the attempt. I remember specifically the particular way time seemed to both slow and compress simultaneously during that movement, each careful step across open ground feeling like it lasted an eternity, while the broader arc of those 3 hours somehow passed in what felt like mere minutes in retrospect. One of the 2 Marines who moved with me, a corporal named Franklin, took a shrapnel wound roughly halfway through that movement, and I remember the specific weight of half carrying, half supporting him for the remaining distance, understanding that stopping to properly address his wound would cost precious time we genuinely didn't have. We reached that relay point, restored coordinated communication, and the resulting artillery support that followed almost certainly prevented our position from being overrun entirely. A fact I understand not through any particular pride in the moment itself, which felt, at the time, more like pure terror managed through simple forward motion, but through what I learned decades later from men who served alongside me, several of whom have told me, more than once at reunions I rarely attend, that they genuinely believe they wouldn't have survived that night without that specific communications restoration. I received the Navy Cross for that action, the second highest decoration the Navy and Marine Corps can bestow for valor in combat, a medal I've kept in a small wooden box in my closet for over 5 decades, rather than displayed anywhere visible in my home, because I've never been entirely comfortable with the idea that a medal adequately represents what actually happened that night, or fully honors the one Marine from my unit who didn't survive the broader engagement, a corporal named Danny Reyes from Texas, 21 years old, whose name I still say quietly to myself every December, around the anniversary of that attack, an anniversary that falls, with a particular cruel irony, right in the middle of the holiday season every single year. I stayed in the Marine Corps for a full career, 24 years total, eventually retiring in 1990 as a master gunnery sergeant, having spent the final decade of my service in a training capacity, working with young Marines on exactly the kind of decision-making under extreme pressure that had defined my own most consequential combat experience. I want to be honest that this particular chapter of my career, unlike the Navy Cross action itself, produced no additional medals, simply the quiet, largely invisible knowledge that I'd shaped, across those years, an untold number of young men who went on to make their own difficult decisions in their own subsequent engagements, decisions that traced back, in ways I'll never fully know, to lessons I'd tried to teach them. I met my wife Carol in 1971, and we married the following year. Carol was a nurse, patient and perceptive in ways that complemented my own more reserved temperament, and she carried, throughout our 37 years of marriage until her passing, a genuine understanding that certain parts of my service simply weren't meant to be discussed in detail, an understanding she never pushed against, trusting instead that whatever weight I carried from that specific night in 1969 was mine to manage in my own time and my own way. We had one son, Kevin, born in 1975, and I want to be honest that raising him, particularly during the years I spent continuing an active military career, followed by decades of what he understood only as vague, unexplained military service, created a particular distance between us that I don't think either of us fully addressed until very recently. I remember specific stretches of Kevin's childhood, evenings when a particular sound or the approach of December each year would shift my mood in ways I never adequately explained. And I remember Carol gently managing those moments on his behalf, offering him some general, age-appropriate reassurance without ever revealing details I wasn't prepared to share even with her fully. Carol passed 9 years ago, and since then I've lived a quiet retirement outside of Charlotte, close enough to Kevin and his family that I remain genuinely involved in my grandchildren's lives, seeing them regularly, though our broader family dynamic has carried, over the years, a particular quality I've only recently begun to fully understand the shape of, a surface-level warmth that never quite extended into the kind of deeper curiosity that might have revealed a fuller picture of who I actually was. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to understanding the rest of this story. I never discussed the specifics of my combat service with my own family in any real detail. This wasn't because I was hiding some deep, unresolved shame, though certainly some of what I carried from that night in 1969 remained genuinely difficult even decades later. It was, more than anything, a deliberate choice, made early in my career and maintained across the following 5 decades, to keep that particular chapter of my life separate from my role as a husband and father, a boundary I maintained partly out of the particular reticence common to men of my generation who served in that specific war, and partly because I genuinely believed, at the time, that shielding my family from the weight of those memories represented a kind of protection I was capable of offering them. Kevin grew up knowing his father had served in the military, a fact mentioned occasionally, but never explored in any real depth, absorbed into his general understanding of me the way children absorb background facts about their parents, without any particular curiosity to investigate further, especially once I retired from active service and settled into what appeared, from the outside, to be an entirely ordinary civilian retirement, spending my days in the garden Carol and I had built together, occasionally attending low-key gatherings with a small circle of fellow veterans who understood, without needing explanation, exactly why certain conversations simply didn't happen at family dinner tables. Kevin built his own career in corporate finance, eventually rising to a senior position at a mid-sized regional company, a career considerably more visible and immediately measurable than mine had ever been, promotions announced with fanfare, bonuses discussed openly among colleagues and friends. Over the years, I watched him develop, gradually, a particular narrative about my career and my life more broadly, one built entirely from the vague, unremarkable surface he'd had access to, a narrative that apparently calcified, over time, into genuine, dismissive judgment about what I'd actually accomplished with my working life. I want to be fair to Kevin here, because it would be easy to paint him simply as cruel, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. He's been, in most respects, a devoted son and an attentive father to his own two children, my grandchildren, Emma, 11, and Tyler, 8. What I've noticed, particularly over recent years, is a specific pattern where Kevin's own visible professional success seemed to increasingly overshadow, in his own mind, whatever quiet, unremarkable contribution he assumed I'd made with my own working life. A pattern that finally crystallized, plainly and painfully, 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, Kevin's company hosted its annual Christmas party, a formal event held at a downtown hotel ballroom, bringing together employees, executives, and their families for an evening of celebration ahead of the holiday. The ballroom had been decorated elaborately, string lights and a towering Christmas tree near the entrance, tables set with the kind of careful formality that told me the company had invested real effort into making this an occasion worth remembering. I attended along with Emma and Tyler, who were excited to be included in what they understood as an important grown-up event, dressed in their holiday best, genuinely thrilled to be part of their father's professional world for an evening, Emma in a red velvet dress she'd specifically asked to wear, Tyler in a small suit he kept adjusting with visible pride. About an hour into the party, standing near a group of Kevin's colleagues while the children played nearby with other employees' kids near a small activity table the company had set up, I overheard a conversation that would set the rest of that evening in motion. One of Kevin's colleagues, making friendly conversation, asked him about his father, gesturing toward where I stood a short distance away, holding a cup of punch and chatting amiably with another employee's spouse. Kevin, perhaps emboldened by the festive atmosphere and a couple of glasses of eggnog, laughed and gestured toward me with his glass. "That's my dad," he said, his voice carrying easily across the small group. "Honestly, between us, he's basically worthless. Never built anything worth talking about. Spent his whole career in the military, doing some vague thing nobody ever got a straight answer about, and then just retired into gardening. Not exactly the kind of story you brag about at a party like this." His colleagues laughed, the uncomfortable, uncertain laugh people offer when a joke lands with more edge than the speaker apparently intended, several of them glancing toward me to gauge whether I'd overheard. I had, every word landing with a particular clarity that made the festive ballroom around me suddenly feel considerably colder, the warm holiday music and twinkling lights suddenly feeling like a strange, discordant backdrop to what I'd just absorbed. What made that moment considerably worse, though, was Emma and Tyler, standing close enough to have heard every word clearly, their expressions carrying the particular confused hurt of children absorbing an adult conversation that contradicts everything they've believed about someone they love. Emma, in particular, glanced toward me with an expression I recognized immediately, the specific look of a child trying to reconcile a harsh public statement with her own private understanding of her grandfather, her small hand instinctively finding Tyler's as though seeking reassurance in the sudden discomfort of the moment. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though some sting was certainly present. Men of my generation, particularly those who carried the specific weight of combat service that by its nature was never meant to be openly discussed or celebrated, develop a certain capacity to absorb this kind of casual dismissal without much visible reaction. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired, familiar recognition of exactly how completely my own decades of chosen silence had shaped my own son's understanding of who I actually was, an understanding now being witnessed, painfully, by my own grandchildren. I didn't respond directly. I found Emma and Tyler, distracted them gently with a conversation about the dessert table, and tried to fold that particular sting quietly away, the way I'd learned to fold away so many similar moments across the preceding decades. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advance knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and the specific mechanics of how it unfolded matter considerably to why it carried the weight it eventually did. About 20 minutes after that overheard exchange, the ballroom's energy shifted, a particular ripple of attention moving through the crowd as the company's CEO, a man named Richard Alvarez, began making his way through the gathering, shaking hands and exchanging brief pleasantries with various employees and their families, the natural circuit of a senior executive working a company holiday party. I want to tell you something about Richard Alvarez that neither Kevin nor anyone else at that party had any reason to know. Nearly 30 years earlier, as a young Marine second lieutenant, Richard Alvarez had been part of a training program I ran during the final decade of my active service, one of dozens of young officers who passed through that training over those years. Though Richard, even as a green young lieutenant, had shown a particular sharpness and integrity that I'd noted and invested additional attention in developing. As Richard continued his progress through the ballroom, his eyes eventually landed on me, standing quietly near the dessert table with Emma and Tyler, and I watched his entire expression shift, recognition dawning across his face with a clarity that made several nearby conversations pause instinctively. He changed direction immediately, walking directly toward me with a purposeful energy that clearly startled the small group of employees he'd been mid-conversation with moments earlier. And as he arrived, he came to full, formal attention and rendered a crisp, unmistakable salute, holding it with the particular precision that comes from decades of practiced discipline. "Gunnery Sergeant Briggs," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quieting ballroom, every nearby conversation having stopped the moment he'd come to attention. "Sir, I had no idea you'd be here tonight. This is genuinely one of the great surprises of my career." I want you to understand what that ballroom looked like in that moment. Kevin, standing perhaps 15 feet away, had gone completely pale, his earlier confident, dismissive posture entirely evaporated. Emma and Tyler stared, wide-eyed, absorbing the sight of their father's own company CEO saluting their grandfather with obvious, genuine reverence. I returned the salute, my hand less steady than it once was, and lowered it as Richard stepped forward to shake my hand warmly, his grip firm, his expression carrying an emotion I recognized as genuine, long-carried gratitude. "Sir," Richard continued, still addressing me but now clearly aware of the audience that had begun gathering around us, "I don't know if the people in this room understand what they're looking at. Master Gunnery Sergeant Briggs earned the Navy Cross in Vietnam for an action that, according to every account I've ever heard from men who served alongside him, saved an entire forward position from being overrun. He then spent the final decade of his active service training young officers like me in exactly the kind of decision-making under pressure that I still, to this day, credit for every difficult call I've made in my subsequent career, including decisions that built the company standing in this room tonight." I felt my throat tighten in a way I hadn't anticipated. Decades of quiet, largely unrecognized contributions suddenly, overwhelmingly witnessed, all at once, in the middle of a company Christmas party I'd attended, expecting nothing more than a pleasant evening with my grandchildren. "Sir," Richard said, "I would be genuinely honored if you'd join me at the head table for the remainder of the evening. I'd like the chance to properly introduce you to some people who I think would be very interested to know exactly who shaped the leadership judgment I've tried to bring to this company." I glanced toward Kevin, whose expression I still think about, somewhere between shock, dawning horror, and something that looked almost like grief, for decades of quiet dinners where nobody had ever thought to ask what his own father had actually done with 24 years of his working life. "I'd be honored, Richard," I said. What followed was, I'll admit, one of the more surreal hours of my later years. Sitting at the head table of a company Christmas party while a CEO told a room full of employees and executives in vivid and generous detail about a combat action decades earlier that most of them, I could tell, had never fully understood the weight of until that moment. Emma and Tyler sat beside me throughout, listening with wide-eyed attention as Richard described their grandfather's service, occasionally glancing toward their father with an expression I recognized as the particular confusion of children realizing that adults, Even their own parents don't always have the full picture. Kevin did not approach our table for nearly 45 minutes. When he finally did, once Richard had momentarily stepped away to greet other guests, his face carried an expression considerably more sober than the confident, dismissive one from earlier in the evening. "Dad," he said quietly, "I don't even know where to start." "You don't have to start anywhere tonight, Kevin," I said. "This is still your company's celebration." "No," he said, his voice cracking. "I need to say this now. I stood 20 feet from here and called you worthless, in front of my own children, at my own company's Christmas party. And I meant it, Dad. I genuinely believed it, because that's the only picture I ever had of you. And I just watched my own CEO salute you like you're the reason he's had the career he's had. I don't even know how to hold both of those things at the same time. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to let him sit in that disorientation a while longer, let the weight of what he'd said, in front of his own children, fully land before I offered him any comfort. But I thought of Carol, and the particular grace she always brought to our family's hardest moments, and I found something steadier instead. "Kevin," I said, "I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it. What happened tonight doesn't erase the fact that you called me worthless in front of Emma and Tyler. That's not something a salute from your CEO fixes on its own. But I am asking you to understand that my worth as your father was never contingent on Richard Alvarez walking across that ballroom tonight. I would have been just as worthy of your respect an hour earlier, before any of this happened. The truth was always there. You just never had the full picture, and I own my part in that, because I never gave it to you." Kevin was crying now, openly, in front of his own children, something I don't think I'd witnessed from my adult son in years. I've spent my entire adult life measuring myself against some vague, unremarkable idea of who you were, Dad, and I just found out I didn't even know who you actually were. I don't know how to undo what Emma and Tyler heard tonight. "You don't undo it," I said. "You make sure they understand the truth going forward, and you make sure they understand that their father is capable of being wrong and correcting course, which is its own kind of important lesson for them to witness." We talked for nearly 2 hours that evening, after the party had largely wound down, sitting together at a quiet corner table with Emma and Tyler nearby, listening with genuine fascination as I told them, for the first time in their young lives, real stories about their great-grandfather's service, stories I'd never previously shared with anyone in the family beyond a small circle of fellow veterans. In the 3 weeks since, something has genuinely shifted between Kevin and me. He calls now, real calls, asking genuine questions about my service, about what it had actually felt like coming home from that particular war into a country that, like so many of my generation experienced, often treated our service with discomfort rather than recognition. He visited last weekend specifically to hear more, sitting with me for nearly 4 hours at my kitchen table, asking careful, respectful questions about Corporal Danny Reyes, about the specific weight of carrying that particular loss every December for over 5 decades. Emma has asked, more than once, to hear more stories, and I've started, carefully and in age-appropriate terms, sharing pieces of my service with her that I'd never previously shared with anyone in the family, watching her absorb each detail with the particular serious attention children give to things they've decided genuinely matter. Tyler has started telling his own friends, with evident pride, that his grandfather is a genuine hero, a description that would have seemed impossible to imagine just weeks earlier. And he's asked, more than once, if he could bring a photograph of me in uniform to show his class during an upcoming school presentation about family history. Richard Alvarez and I have stayed in touch since that Christmas party as well, meeting for coffee twice now, and he mentioned, during our most recent conversation, that the story of that evening had already become something of a quiet legend within his company, employees who'd witnessed it firsthand sharing the account with colleagues who hadn't been present, a small ripple effect that continues, in its own way, to remind people throughout that organization of the kind of quiet, largely invisible service that sometimes shapes the very leadership judgment they benefit from without ever knowing its origin. Kevin has also, I've learned, started speaking to his own colleagues about me with an entirely different tone than the dismissive characterization from that Christmas party, something considerably closer to genuine hard-earned pride, understanding now, at least in broad strokes, exactly what those decades of silence had actually contained. And understanding, too, the particular cost of having let his own children witness him dismiss that history so carelessly before he'd ever bothered to ask the right questions himself. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old Marine called worthless by his own son. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The people who love us sometimes build entire identities around incomplete understandings of who we actually are, and sometimes, painfully, that incompleteness gets witnessed by the very children who look up to us most. That doesn't mean healing happens instantly, the moment truth finally surfaces. It requires the harder, slower work of actually talking, conversation by conversation, until decades of silence finally give way to something considerably more honest. I spent nearly 6 decades being understood by my own son as a man who never amounted to much. It took a company CEO walking across a Christmas party ballroom to finally show my grandchildren otherwise, but it's taken the weeks since, conversation by conversation, for that revelation to become the kind of genuine, lasting understanding that a single dramatic moment alone could never fully provide. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family whose full story you might not fully know, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.